Welcome to another deep dive with us.
It's great to be here.
And today we're going to be focusing on a question that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds these days. How many hours should we actually be working?
That's right.
And we're going to be taking a real-world look at this
Yeah.
by diving into working hours in India.
Looking forward to this.
We've got a whole mix of sources for this one. We have some articles, we've got some personal stories, and even some passionate opinions coming from a Reddit thread.
That's always fun.
Yeah. So to really understand this, we have to look at the situation that I think a lot of Indian workers might find themselves in. Imagine you're working an 8-hour workday. You finish all of your tasks efficiently. But instead of heading home, you feel this unspoken pressure to stay at the office even longer. So why is that? Well, our first article here from Frontline, it introduces us to Rohan and Aditi. They're two white-collar workers who work for multinational companies in India. And they describe this exact experience.
And their stories are definitely not unique. This article highlights a surprising reason behind this pressure to overwork. It's the Factories Act of 1948.
Okay.
It was originally intended to protect factory workers from exploitation, but the language has been kind of interpreted in a way that allows companies to avoid paying overtime to their white-collar employees.
So a law that was meant to protect workers is now being used to justify longer working hours without any extra pay.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. The article shares the story of Amit K. He's worked for a London-based company for 17 years, and he noticed that Filipino employees doing the same work as their Indian counterparts actually get overtime pay,
Wow,
but the Indian employees don't.
that's a huge discrepancy. So is this just a legal loophole, or is there a deeper cultural element at play here?
Well, that's where this Reddit thread comes in. The opinions shared in this thread really paint a picture of a culture of what they call presenteeism. It's very common in Indian workplaces.
Presenteeism, okay.
And it's this idea that if you're physically at the office for extended hours, then it's seen as a sign of dedication and commitment, regardless of your actual productivity.
So it's more important to just be seen at your desk than it is to actually be getting your work done efficiently.
Kind of, yeah. One user even commented that leaving before your boss or senior colleagues, even if you finished all your work, is considered a career-limiting move.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of pressure there.
Yeah, talk about pressure. But if everyone's working late, then doesn't that mean that even the people who are really efficient, they're going to feel like they have to stay late too?
Oh, absolutely. It can be incredibly frustrating for those employees who really value efficiency and want to have a good work-life balance.
And it seems like having a life outside of work is really hard. One user in the Reddit thread even said that they barely have time for hobbies, let alone an actual social life.
Right.
So do you think this intense work culture is related to low wages? Like if people aren't making enough during a standard workday, maybe they're working longer hours to try and make ends meet?
That's a great point. And it's actually backed up by one of our articles here. Long working hours can be harmful to health. It states that India has one of the lowest minimum wages in the whole Asia-Pacific region.
Wow, okay.
So yeah, I think financial pressure definitely plays a role in this whole overwork culture.
That makes sense. But here's the catch. This same article also talks about some of the serious health risks associated with working 55 or more hours per week, like an increased risk of stroke and heart disease.
Yeah, that's a really serious and sobering reality. I think it really underscores how important it is that we take a hard look at how we view work.
Definitely. Even the World Health Organization Director General has weighed in on this, saying that no job is worth the risk of stroke or heart disease.
That's a powerful statement.
So it seems like there's this whole combination of factors, like outdated laws, a culture of presenteeism, and potential financial pressures. And they all seem to contribute to the problem of long working hours in India. But what about those new labor reforms you mentioned earlier? Could those help provide some solutions to this problem?
Let's discuss that in the next part of our deep dive. Yeah, so the India Labor Laws article, it outlines 4 new labor codes that were recently introduced in India.
Okay, so how do these new laws address this issue of the long working hours?
So one of the main changes is that there's now a cap on the number of hours you can work each day and each week. So the new codes set a maximum of 12 hours per day and 48 hours per week.
So finally, there's a legal limit. But if someone's trying to have a 4-day work week, wouldn't that still mean that their workdays would be longer?
Yeah, exactly. That's what makes things really interesting because another article, New Labor Laws, actually explores the possibility of a 4-day work week actually becoming a thing in India.
Wait, a 4-day work week in India? That sounds like a pretty big change. What would be the benefits and downsides of something like that?
Well, the article goes into both. On the one hand, a 4-day work week could give employees longer periods to rest, which would hopefully improve their well-being and work-life balance.
So it's like trading longer work days for an extra day off every week. I can see the appeal there. But what about the downsides?
The article says that those longer workdays could actually lead to more stress and fatigue, which might actually cancel out the benefits of having that extra day off.
Ah, so it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
But even if this 4-day work week was legal, I wonder if companies would actually want to make such a drastic change, especially given the culture of long working hours that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's definitely a valid concern because labor reforms are only as good as their implementation and how willing companies are to actually change their ways.
That's true. Speaking of these new labor codes, they also address the issue of leave right.
They do. The new codes actually lower the requirement for when employees are eligible to start taking leave. So now it's 180 days of work in a year instead of 240 days.
Oh, okay, so now new employees can start taking leave sooner. That's great.
But there's a bit of a catch. The total number of leaves that an employee earns each year stays the same. So it's still 1 day of leave for every 20 days that they work.
Gotcha.
And there's another change, too. It's now mandatory for employers to pay employees for any leave that goes over the carry-forward limit.
So they have to pay them for unused leave. How does that work?
So let's say the carry-forward limit for leave is 30 days. But you have 40 days of leave saved up at the end of the year. Your employer has to pay you for those extra 10 days.
So that's quite different from the current system, right?
It is. Currently under the Shops and Establishment Act, leave encashment usually only happens when someone resigns or retires. So these new codes are trying to find a balance between benefits for the employee and the costs for the company.
It's a lot to take in. But even with these new reforms, there's one big thing that we haven't talked about yet. Work from home.
Right. The pandemic really made remote work much more common, and India was no exception to that.
Yeah, for sure. So how do these labor codes even apply to people who work remotely? Like, how do you keep track of working hours and overtime and leave when someone's working from home?
Well, the new labor laws article actually mentions this. It says that the government is aware of work from home arrangements, and they even included it in their draft model standing order for the service industry.
Okay, so they're acknowledging it. But does that actually mean there are clear guidelines for companies to follow?
That's where things aren't so clear, because the article says that there aren't any detailed guidelines yet to actually help companies figure out how to implement work-from-home policies in a way that's fair and effective.
So it's kind of a gray area right now. And without any clear guidelines, I can see how it would be really easy for the lines between work and personal life to get blurred, which could actually make this problem of long working hours even worse.
Absolutely. It really highlights the need for more specific rules and for a more thoughtful approach to regulating work, especially as the world of work keeps changing.
So we've got these new labor codes, which are definitely a step in the right direction. But it seems like there are still a lot of questions about how they'll actually be implemented, especially with so many people working remotely now.
Right.
And we also have to remember that laws can only do so much. They can't completely change a culture overnight.
Exactly.
So what about the companies themselves? What can they do to create a better work-life balance for their employees, whether they're working in the office or from home?
That's a great question, and that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've talked about the laws and the culture in India, but at the end of the day, it's the companies that really shape what it's like to work there, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. Companies have a big responsibility to create a good work environment. They can choose to just follow the minimum requirements of the law, or they can go above and beyond and really build a culture that values their employees' well-being just as much as productivity.
So how do companies actually do that? How do they actually put those ideas into practice?
Well, it's interesting because that Reddit thread we mentioned, it actually has some really good examples of this. Some users talked about companies that encourage their employees to leave the office on time, and they also offer things like flexible work schedules.
That's great to hear. It shows that change is possible. But what about some practical tips for avoiding overwork ourselves? I remember that article, Long Working Hours Can Be Harmful to Health, had some advice.
Oh yeah, it did. It emphasized using time management techniques, like making sure to prioritize your tasks and setting realistic deadlines for yourself. And it also said how important it is to set boundaries between work and your personal life, which can be especially hard when you're working remotely.
Yeah, it's way too easy to feel like you're always on
Yeah.
when your office is just your laptop. But what about the companies themselves? What can they do to create a culture that supports those healthy habits?
I think it's all about shifting the focus from how many hours someone is sitting at their desk to the quality and efficiency of the work they're actually doing. Companies can make policies that encourage flexible work hours and encourage people to take breaks and even limit those after-hours emails and phone calls that we all hate.
Yeah, I think it's a real mental shift that needs to happen,
Okay.
both for individuals and for companies. Like, we need to start thinking of work as more of a sprint than a marathon.
Exactly. And that actually brings us back to our listeners, because you have the power to change things too. You don't just have to passively accept a work culture that makes you sacrifice your well-being.
So what can our listeners do to protect themselves in this kind of environment?
I think the most important thing is to know your rights. Start by really understanding what these new labor codes say. And then don't be afraid to have open and honest conversations with your colleagues and managers about how to create a more balanced and sustainable work environment.
It's about knowing your worth and setting those boundaries for yourself right.
Exactly. And I know that's not always easy, especially in a culture where working a lot is often seen as a good thing. But putting your health and well-being first is so important.
So to wrap things up today, it's clear that India's work culture is at a turning point. You have these outdated laws, you have this deeply ingrained culture of presenteeism, and now you have this huge increase in remote work. It's like all these things are coming together at once.
It is.
But there are some signs of hope, too.
Yeah.
There are new labor reforms, there are companies that are adopting more progressive practices, and there are people who are standing up for their right to a better work-life balance.
Right.
So for our listeners, the key takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to challenge how things have always been done.
That's right.
Speak up for what you need. Set those boundaries for yourself. Find ways to work smarter, not harder. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be part of the movement that finally brings that 4-day work week to India.
I hope so.
It's all about creating a future of work that's both productive and fulfilling. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for that work-life balance